The coffee cup trembled in Detective Sarah Martinez's hands as she stared at the DNA match results on her computer screen. After 14 years, the name glowing back at her in stark black letters made her stomach drop like a stone through ice water. Outside her cramped office window, the October rain hammered against the glass of the Millbrook Police Department, each drop echoing the thundering of her heart. "No way," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ancient heater rattling in the corner. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting dancing shadows across the case file that had consumed her thoughts for the better part of 2 years. Emily Johnson's photograph stared back at her from the manila folder. 16 years old, bright smile, auburn hair catching sunlight in what would be her last school portrait. Emily had vanished on a Tuesday evening in November 2009. She'd been walking home from her job at Miller's hardware store, the same route she'd taken every weekday for 6 months. The stretch of Maple Street between downtown and the residential area was well lit, familiar, safe, or so everyone had believed. Sarah's phone buzzed against the wooden desk, jolting her from her trance. Chief Robert Hawkins' gruff voice filled the small space. "Martinez, you need to see this. Conference room, now." The hallway felt longer than usual as Sarah walked toward the conference room, her sensible black shoes clicking against the worn linoleum. The building held the weight of decades, coffee stains on carpet, scuff marks on walls, the persistent smell of disinfectant mixed with the ghosts of 1,000 cigarettes smoked back when that was still allowed. She'd spent 3 years in this building, but today it felt foreign, like she was seeing it through someone else's eyes. Chief Hawkins stood at the head of the oval table, his weathered face grave. Beside him sat Agent Lisa Chen, a woman Sarah had worked with on 2 previous cases. Agent Chen's presence meant this was bigger than a routine update. "Sit down, Sarah," Chief Hawkins said, his voice carrying an unusual gentleness. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to process." Sarah sank into the plastic chair, the DNA results still clutched in her hand. "I think I already know, Chief. The DNA match from Emily Johnson's case." "David Mitchell," Agent Chen interrupted, her voice steady but her eyes showing the strain. "Respected member of this community for 32 years. High school chemistry teacher, volunteer firefighter, church deacon. Married to Catherine Mitchell for 29 years. 2 grown children, both teachers themselves." The room fell silent except for the rain continuing its assault on the windows and the distant hum of the copy machine in the hallway. Sarah felt the world tilting slightly, as if the building itself was struggling to maintain its foundation. David Mitchell had taught at Millbrook High School since 1991. He'd been Emily's chemistry teacher during her sophomore year, 2 years before her disappearance. Sarah remembered him from her own high school days. Mr. Mitchell was the teacher who made chemistry interesting, who stayed after school to help struggling students, who chaperoned dances and donated his time to tutor kids who couldn't afford extra help. "The DNA was found on Emily's jacket," Sarah said slowly, her detective training taking over even as her personal understanding of her hometown crumbled. Agent Chen nodded. Skin cells under the fingernails embedded in the fabric. The jacket had been buried approximately 4 feet deep, wrapped in plastic. The preservation was remarkable considering the time frame. Chief Hawkins cleared his throat. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. This arrest is going to tear this town apart. David Mitchell isn't just a teacher. He's coached Little League for 15 years. He's organized the annual Christmas food drive. He's been a pallbearer at half the funerals in this town. People trust him with their children." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah thought of her own younger sister Maria, who'd had Mr. Mitchell for chemistry just 5 years ago. She thought of the countless students who'd walked through his classroom, the parents who trusted him at school events, the community that had elevated him to a position of respect and authority.
"There's more," Agent Chen continued, opening a thick folder. "We've been in contact with surrounding jurisdictions. There are 3 other cases, unsolved disappearances of teenage girls, that show similar patterns, all within a 100-mile radius. All girls who had some connection to David Mitchell, either as students or through community activities." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. "How many girls?" 4 total, including Emily. The earliest case dates back to 2005. Jennifer Walsh from Carthage, she was 17, volunteered at a church camp where Mitchell was a counselor. Then Rebecca Santos from Webb City in 2007. She attended a chemistry summer program Mitchell taught at the community college. Emily in 2009, and Megan Torres from Neosho in 2011. She was part of the regional science fair that Mitchell helped judge. The names hung in the air like accusation and grief combined. 4 families. 4 sets of parents who'd spent years wondering, hoping, grieving. 4 communities that had searched woods and fields, printed flyers, held vigils, and slowly watched hope transform into the dull ache of unresolved loss. "We're executing the arrest warrant tonight," Chief Hawkins said. "Mitchell doesn't know we've connected him to Emily's case. He's been living his normal life, teaching classes, attending church, having dinner with his family. Sarah, I need you there for the arrest, but I also need you to understand that after tonight, Millbrook will never be the same." Sarah looked down at Emily Johnson's photograph again. The girl's eyes seemed to hold secrets now, mysteries that had taken 14 years to surface. Emily had been a junior when she disappeared, planning to study environmental science in college. She'd wanted to help protect the rivers and forests of Missouri, to make the world a cleaner, safer place for future generations. Instead, she'd become another statistic, another face on a missing person flyer, another family destroyed by an unthinkable betrayal. His wife, Catherine? Does she know? Agent Shen shook her head. "We've been watching the house for 3 days. Catherine Mitchell appears to be following her normal routine, teaching at the elementary school, attending book club meetings, caring for her elderly mother. There's been no indication that she suspects anything. Either she's an exceptional actress, or she's been living with a stranger for 30 years. The thought sent a chill through Sarah's body. How well did anyone really know the people closest to them? How many secrets could a person hide behind a smile, behind acts of kindness, behind a reputation built over decades? Chief Hawkins stood up, signaling the meeting's end. "The arrest happens at 8 p.m., when Mitchell gets home from his evening tutoring session. We'll have backup units, but we expect him to come quietly. Men like him usually do. They rely on their reputation to protect them, and when that's gone, they often just collapse." Sarah gathered the case files, her hands steadier now that she had a plan of action. But as she walked back to her office, questions multiplied in her mind like ripples in a disturbed pond. How had David Mitchell maintained his double life for so long? What had triggered him to kill? How many other girls might there be? Girls whose cases hadn't been connected yet. Girls whose families were still waiting for answers that might never come. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the windows, but the storm inside Sarah's mind was just beginning. In 3 hours, they would arrest a man who'd been trusted with the education and care of thousands of children. In 3 hours, the carefully constructed image of Millbrook as a safe, close-knit community would shatter like glass. Emily Johnson had been dead for 14 years, but tonight the truth of her murder would finally begin to breathe. Detective Sarah Martinez had never imagined that her return to Millbrook would involve unraveling the carefully woven fabric of her childhood memories. Growing up in this town of 12,000 people, she'd known safety in the way that children do, absolutely and without question. Every face was familiar, every corner held a memory, and every adult was someone's parent or teacher or neighbor who could be trusted to help if needed. She had left for college in Kansas City, determined to see the world beyond Missouri's rolling hills and endless fields of corn and soybeans. Criminal justice had called to her during her sophomore year when a guest speaker, a detective from the KCPD, had talked about the satisfaction of bringing answers to families who'd lost hope. She'd imagined herself solving cases in the big city, working complicated investigations that spanned multiple states, making a difference in the lives of strangers who needed justice.
Instead, life had brought her home 3 years ago when her father suffered a heart attack at 54. She'd taken a temporary leave of absence from her job with the Kansas City Police Department, intending to help her mother manage the family's small accounting business until her father recovered. But Thomas Martinez never fully recovered, and Sarah found herself sliding into a life she'd never planned, caring for aging parents, taking over client relationships her father had maintained for 20 years, and eventually accepting a position with the Millbrook Police Department when the stress of juggling 2 worlds became too much. The transition from big city detective to small-town police work had been jarring. In Kansas City, cases moved quickly through the system. There were specialists for every type of crime, resources for extensive investigations, and enough distance between officers and victims that emotional attachment rarely complicated the work. In Millbrook, Sarah found herself investigating break-ins at businesses owned by her high school classmates, domestic disputes involving couples she'd known since childhood, and traffic accidents where she recognized every name in the report. Emily Johnson's case had been different from the beginning. Sarah's first week on the job, Chief Hawkins had handed her a box of files, cold cases that previous investigators had worked sporadically over the years. "Keep these on your desk," he'd said. "Work them when you have time between calls. Don't expect miracles, but don't give up either. Sometimes fresh eyes see what tired ones miss." Emily's file had been third from the top, a manila folder thick with witness statements, search records, and photographs that told the story of a community's desperate attempt to find one of their own. Sarah had opened it, expecting another routine review, but something about Emily's case had grabbed hold of her and refused to let go. Perhaps it was because Emily had been only 2 years behind Sarah in school. They'd shared hallways and cafeteria lines, though they'd never been friends. Emily had been quiet, studious, part of the environmental club and volunteer service organizations. She'd worked at Miller's Hardware after school, saving money for college with a systematic dedication that marked her as someone with clear goals and the determination to achieve them. Or perhaps it was the way Emily's mother, Linda Johnson, still maintained her daughter's bedroom exactly as it had been 14 years ago. Sarah had visited the Johnson house 4 times during her investigation, and each time she'd noticed new details that spoke of a mother's refusal to accept loss. Emily's bed was still made with the same purple comforter. Her desk still held chemistry textbooks and college brochures. Her closet still contained clothes that would have been fashionable in 2009, but now looked like artifacts from another era. Linda Johnson was 59 years old, her hair gray and her face lined with the particular weariness that comes from years of unresolved grief. She'd never remarried after Emily's father died in a construction accident when Emily was 12. The two of them had been a unit, mother and daughter, facing the world together, making plans for Emily's future that included regular visits home from whatever college she chose to attend. "I keep thinking she'll walk through that door," Linda had told Sarah during their last visit. "I know it's been 14 years. I know she's not coming home. But sometimes when I'm cooking dinner, I still make enough for 2. Sometimes I buy her favorite shampoo at the store without thinking. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I swear I can hear her laugh coming from her room." Sarah had sat in Emily's childhood bedroom, surrounded by posters of nature scenes and quotes about environmental protection, and felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing down like a physical force. What had Emily been thinking during her last moments? Had she been afraid? Had she fought back? Had she called out for her mother, for help that would never come? The breakthrough had come 3 months ago, when construction crews began developing Riverside Park for a new community center. The park had been a popular spot for families when Sarah was growing up. Picnic tables scattered among oak trees, a small playground, and walking trails that followed the meandering path of Mill Creek. But budget constraints had led to years of deferred maintenance, and the park had gradually become overgrown and neglected. When the excavation crew found the plastic-wrapped bundle buried near the creek, they'd initially thought it might be construction debris left by previous workers, but something about it,
The careful way it had been wrapped, the deliberate nature of its burial, had prompted them to call the police rather than simply disposing of it with the rest of the construction waste. Sarah had been the first officer on scene. She'd watched as the medical examiner carefully unwrapped the plastic sheeting to reveal Emily's jacket. A denim jacket with patches from various environmental organizations, the same jacket Emily had been wearing in the last photograph taken of her alive. The jacket that had been described in every missing person report, every search bulletin, every desperate plea for information that Linda Johnson had distributed throughout the community. The preservation had been remarkable. Buried in clay soil near the creek, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, the jacket had remained in a state that allowed for detailed forensic analysis. The DNA extraction had taken weeks. The comparison process had taken longer, but finally, the results had come back with a match that nobody could have predicted. David Mitchell had been Sarah's chemistry teacher during her junior year of high school. She remembered him as enthusiastic and patient, someone who could make complex concepts understandable through clear explanations and creative demonstrations. He'd sponsored the Science Olympiad team, coached students through difficult coursework, and written countless letters of recommendation for college applications. Sarah thought about her own interactions with Mr. Mitchell, staying after class for extra help with chemical equations, participating in the elaborate experiments he designed for special occasions, feeling proud when he praised her work in front of other students. Had Emily had similar experiences? Had she trusted Mr. Mitchell the way Sarah had? Had that trust been part of what made her vulnerable? The personal nature of the revelation made everything more complicated. This wasn't a stranger who had invaded their community and committed violence before disappearing. This was someone who had been part of the fabric of Millbrook for 3 decades, someone who had taught their children, volunteered at their events, contributed to their sense of safety and stability. Sarah found herself examining her own memories, searching for signs she might have missed, moments that might have seemed innocent at the time but could now be viewed through a different lens. She remembered Mr. Mitchell offering to drive students home after late tutoring sessions. She remembered him chaperoning school dances, always with a camera, always taking pictures of students having fun. She remembered him volunteering for camping trips and outdoor education programs, positions that put him in close contact with teenage girls away from their parents and normal support systems. But she also remembered genuine moments of kindness and connection. Mr. Mitchell had attended her high school graduation, shaking hands with parents and congratulating students on their achievements. He'd sent a card when her father had his heart attack, expressing concern and offering help with anything the family might need. He'd been part of the search efforts when Emily first disappeared, joining volunteer groups that combed through woods and fields, calling Emily's name into the darkness. How did someone maintain such a convincing facade? How did they continue teaching and mentoring young people while harboring the capacity for violence? How did they sit through parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings and community celebrations, knowing what they had done? The questions circled through Sarah's mind as she prepared for the arrest. She'd changed into her tactical vest and checked her weapon, following procedures she'd performed countless times in Kansas City, but never in Millbrook. The weight of the bulletproof vest felt heavier here, more ominous, as if the very act of putting it on acknowledged that her hometown was no longer the safe haven she'd once believed it to be. Agent Chen had briefed them on Mitchell's expected behavior during the arrest. Men like him often react with shock and denial initially, she'd explained. They've convinced themselves that they're good people who made mistakes, or they've compartmentalized their actions so completely that they genuinely believe their public persona is their true self. Don't expect him to confess immediately. Don't expect him to show remorse. Expect him to express concern for his family and his reputation. Sarah thought about Catherine Mitchell, David's wife. She'd had Mrs. Mitchell for 4th grade back when she was Catherine Williams and taught at Millbrook Elementary. She'd been a favorite teacher, creative, patient, always willing to help struggling students catch up or challenge advanced learners to reach further. After marrying David Mitchell in 1996, she'd continued teaching, becoming a fixture in the elementary school where she'd influenced hundreds of children over nearly 3 decades. How would Catherine react to the news that her husband was accused of murder? How would she reconcile the man she'd been married to for 29 years with the man who had killed Emily Johnson? How would she face her students and their parents, knowing that her name would forever be connected to these crimes through no fault of her own?
The Mitchell children, Rebecca and Michael, were adults now, both following their parents into education. Rebecca taught high school English in Springfield, while Michael was a middle school principal in Joplin. They'd grown up as part of Millbrook's most respected family, children of teachers who had inherited their parents' commitment to education and community service. Sarah wondered what it would mean for them to learn that their father was not the man they'd believed him to be. Would they doubt their own memories of childhood? Would they question every moment of affection, every piece of advice, every expression of pride in their accomplishments? Would they wonder if other families would ever trust them with their children again? The complexity of the situation weighed heavily on Sarah's mind as she drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook toward the Mitchell house. This wasn't just about arresting a suspect and closing a cold case. This was about shattering the fundamental assumptions that held a community together. This was about forcing hundreds of people to question their own judgment, their own safety, their own understanding of the people they'd trusted with their most precious possessions, their children. Emily Johnson deserved justice. Her mother deserved answers. The other victims and their families deserved to know the truth. But Sarah couldn't help but think about the collateral damage that truth would cause. The innocent people whose lives would be forever changed by the revelation of David Mitchell's crimes. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the glow of street lights and the warm yellow light spilling from windows of houses where families were settling in for another ordinary evening. Soon, those same windows would frame conversations that no parent ever wanted to have with their children. Soon, those same streets would be filled with neighbors trying to make sense of the unthinkable. Sarah pulled into the parking lot of the police station to meet the other officers who would participate in the arrest. In 30 minutes, they would drive to 847 Oak Street, where David Mitchell lived with his wife in a two-story colonial house with a wraparound porch and carefully maintained flower beds. In 30 minutes, they would knock on a door that had welcomed thousands of visitors over the years, students seeking help, colleagues sharing meals, neighbors borrowing tools or offering assistance. In 30 minutes, Emily Johnson would finally have justice, and Millbrook would begin the long, painful process of learning to live with a truth that would change everything. The arrest of David Mitchell unfolded with a quiet precision that seemed almost anticlimactic given the magnitude of what it represented. Sarah had expected drama, shouting, resistance, denial loud enough to wake the neighbors. Instead, she found herself witnessing the collapse of a carefully constructed life, with all the ceremony of a building being demolished in slow motion. Mitchell answered the door wearing a cardigan sweater and khakis, looking exactly like the teacher Sarah remembered from her high school years. His hair had grown thinner and grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes still had that same attentive quality that had made him popular with students and parents alike. When Chief Hawkins announced the reason for their visit, Mitchell's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been relief. "I see," he said quietly, stepping back to allow them entrance. May I tell her what's happening?" The scene that followed would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. Catherine Mitchell emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face brightening with the kind of smile reserved for unexpected but welcome visitors. She'd been making her famous oatmeal cookies. Sarah could smell the cinnamon and vanilla wafting from the kitchen, probably for the bake sale at school or one of the many community events she supported throughout the year. "Sarah Martinez," she said warmly, not yet noticing the tension radiating from the group of officers crowded into her living room. "I remember you from elementary school. How are your parents doing? I heard your father had some health troubles." The kindness in her voice, the genuine concern in her eyes, made what came next feel like a physical assault.
"There must be some mistake," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. "David teaches chemistry. He helps children. He couldn't." She looked at her husband, searching his face for the denial that never came. David Mitchell stood with his hands at his sides, neither reaching for his wife nor stepping away from her. His silence spoke volumes, and Sarah realized that Agent Chen had been wrong about one thing. David Mitchell wasn't going to claim innocence. He was going to let his life end with the same quiet dignity with which he'd apparently lived it. The logistics of the arrest took less than 20 minutes. Mitchell was read his rights, handcuffed with minimal resistance, and escorted to the patrol car while his wife stood in their doorway, still holding the dish towel, still trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Neighbors had begun to emerge from their houses, drawn by the unusual sight of multiple police vehicles on their quiet street. Sarah found herself assigned to stay with Catherine until the Mitchell children could be contacted and arrangements could be made for support. It was a kindness that felt like punishment, sitting in the living room where family photographs documented 3 decades of birthdays, graduations, vacations, and celebrations, all now rendered suspect by the revelation of David Mitchell's true nature. The phone calls were brutal to witness, Catherine's voice shaking as she tried to explain to her daughter, Rebecca, what had happened. The long silences as she listened to questions she couldn't answer. The way she kept saying, "I don't understand," as if repetition might somehow make the situation make sense. "Mom, are you safe?" Rebecca's voice was loud enough for Sarah to hear through the phone. "Do you need me to come home?" "I don't know," Catherine replied honestly. "I don't know anything anymore." Michael's reaction was different, anger rather than disbelief. "This is insane," Sarah could hear him saying. "Dad coaches Little League. He volunteers at the church. Someone made a mistake, Mom. Someone got the DNA wrong or mixed up the samples or something." But Catherine had seen her husband's face when the charges were read. She'd seen the way he'd accepted the handcuffs without protest, the way he'd avoided her eyes as he was led away. 30 years of marriage had taught her to read his expressions, and what she'd read in that moment was not innocence, but resignation. The media attention began within hours. Millbrook had never been the site of a major criminal investigation, and the combination of a cold case solving, a respected teacher's arrest, and the possibility of multiple victims created a perfect storm of interest from regional and national news outlets. By morning, satellite trucks lined the street outside the police station. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, former students, parents, neighbors, anyone who had an opinion about David Mitchell or Emily Johnson or the impact of the arrest on their community. The coverage quickly divided into predictable narratives. Some focused on the heroic work of investigators, finally bringing closure to grieving families, while others emphasized the shock and betrayal felt by a community, learning that they'd trusted a predator with their children. Sarah found herself at the center of the investigation in ways that felt both familiar and completely foreign. Her experience with major crimes in Kansas City had prepared her for the technical aspects of the case: evidence processing, interview techniques, coordination with federal agents. But nothing had prepared her for investigating someone she'd known personally, in a community where everyone had an opinion and every piece of evidence carried emotional weight. The search of the Mitchell house yielded disturbing discoveries. Hidden in David's home office, behind files of lesson plans and student grade sheets, investigators found a collection of photographs that made Sarah's stomach turn. None were explicitly criminal. They were pictures taken at school events, camping trips, science fairs, graduation parties, all now rendered suspect by the revelation of David Mitchell's true nature. But it was the other girls who created the most chilling picture. Jennifer Walsh from Carthage, Rebecca Santos from Webb City, Megan Torres from Neosho, all appeared multiple times in Mitchell's collection, all photographed during the months and years before their disappearances. The photos suggested a pattern of selection and stalking that contradicted the image of impulsive crimes that some had initially theorized. Agent Chen brought in a behavioral analyst from Quantico who helped construct a profile that was both illuminating and terrifying. David Mitchell hadn't been a killer who happened to teach. He'd been a teacher who had used his position to identify and access victims. His reputation as a dedicated educator had provided him with opportunities to photograph young women, to learn their schedules and habits, to establish himself as a trusted figure in their lives. "He's what we call a preferential offender," Agent Chan explained to the task force that had been assembled to investigate the full scope of Mitchell's crimes. He targeted a specific type of victim, intelligent, ambitious teenage girls who were often from single-parent households or families where the parents worked multiple jobs. Girls who might appreciate extra attention from a caring teacher, who might be more likely to trust an adult offering help or mentorship. The description fit all 4 known victims perfectly. Emily Johnson's father had died when she was 12, leaving her mother to work 2 jobs to support them. Jennifer Walsh had been raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident. Rebecca Santos lived with her mother, who worked nights at a factory. Megan Torres was from a family where both parents worked long hours running a small restaurant. Sarah realized that Mitchell had been hunting for vulnerability disguised as independence. He'd looked for girls who were mature beyond their years, who were used to taking care of themselves, who might be flattered by attention from an adult who seemed to understand their goals and ambitions. Girls who were less likely to be missed immediately if they disappeared. Girls whose families might be too busy or too trusting to question a teacher's motives. The revelations kept coming as investigators expanded their search. Mitchell's computer contained years of internet searches related to the missing girls, news articles about their disappearances, social media profiles of their friends and family members, online forums where amateur investigators discussed theories about what might have happened to them. He'd been following the investigations into his own crimes, watching families suffer while maintaining his facade of concern and community involvement. Perhaps most disturbing was the journal entries found in Mitchell's desk drawer. Written in the careful handwriting Sarah remembered from chemistry class, the entries revealed a man who saw himself as misunderstood rather than criminal. He wrote about the girls with a possessive affection that made Sarah feel physically ill, describing them as special and different from other teenagers in ways that revealed his complete inability to understand the horror of what he'd done to them. Emily understood the beauty of chemistry in ways her classmates never could. Read one entry dated 3 weeks before Emily's disappearance. She sees the connections between elements, the way simple compounds can create something new and beautiful. She reminds me of myself at that age. Curious, intelligent, unappreciated by peers who couldn't understand her depth. The community's reaction to these revelations followed predictable but painful patterns. Some residents refused to believe that David Mitchell could be guilty, insisting that the evidence must be flawed or that he was being framed by incompetent investigators. Others swung to the opposite extreme, re-examining every interaction they'd ever had with Mitchell and finding sinister motives in previously innocent memories. Parents pulled their children out of classes taught by other male teachers. The school board called emergency meetings to review background check procedures and supervision policies. Church leadership struggled with how to address the fact that one of their deacons had been living alive for decades.
The volunteer fire department had to address questions about Mitchell's access to emergency scenes and his interactions with victims of accidents and fires. Sarah found herself fielding calls from parents who wanted to know if their children had been in danger during their time in Mitchell's classes. The honest answer was that they didn't know. Investigators were still working to determine the full scope of his crimes. But that uncertainty was almost worse than confirmed danger would have been. At least with confirmed danger, parents could process their grief and move forward. With uncertainty, they were left to wonder and worry and examine every memory for signs they might have missed. The most heartbreaking calls came from Mitchell's former students who genuinely benefited from his teaching. Sarah spoke with adults who credited Mitchell with inspiring their careers in science, who remembered him as the teacher who had believed in them when others hadn't, who had provided guidance and support during difficult periods of their adolescence.
"He literally saved my life," one former student told Sarah through tears. "I was failing chemistry, ready to drop out of school, convinced I was too stupid to succeed. Mr. Mitchell spent hours tutoring me, convinced me I could do the work, helped me get into college. I became a chemical engineer because of him. How am I supposed to reconcile that with what you're telling me he did?"
There was no good answer to that question. David Mitchell had apparently been capable of genuine kindness and devastating cruelty simultaneously. He'd helped some students while hunting others. He'd inspired some young people to reach for their dreams while destroying the dreams of others completely. The investigation expanded to include a review of every student who had been in Mitchell's classes over 30 years of teaching. Investigators contacted hundreds of former students, looking for reports of inappropriate behavior, uncomfortable interactions, or boundary violations that might have been dismissed or unreported at the time they occurred. Most of the responses were positive. Former students who remembered Mitchell as a good teacher who had maintained appropriate boundaries and shown genuine concern for their education and well-being. But scattered among those testimonials were troubling reports that created a more complex picture. Several women reported that Mitchell had offered them rides home after school activities, sometimes taking routes that seemed longer than necessary. Others remembered him making comments about their appearance that had seemed inappropriate at the time, but were dismissed as harmless compliments. A few recalled feeling uncomfortable when Mitchell found reasons to be alone with them in his classroom or during field trips, though nothing overtly criminal had occurred. "He had a way of making you feel special," one former student told investigators, "like you were more mature and intelligent than other kids your age. At the time, I was flattered. Looking back, I realize he was grooming me for something that, thank God, never happened." The pattern that emerged was of a man who had tested boundaries carefully, withdrawing when students seemed uncomfortable or when parents might notice, escalating only when he felt confident that his targets were vulnerable and unlikely to report inappropriate behavior. Sarah began to understand that Emily, Jennifer, Rebecca, and Megan might not have been Mitchell's only victims. They might simply have been the ones who had resisted his advances strongly enough to trigger his violence. There might be other young women who had been assaulted or manipulated by Mitchell but had never reported it, either because they hadn't recognized what had happened to them at the time or because they'd been too ashamed or afraid to come forward. The task force set up a confidential tip line and worked with victim services organizations to create a safe space for anyone who might have information about Mitchell's behavior. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of calls from former students, parents, colleagues, and community members who had witnessed or experienced interactions with Mitchell that, viewed in the context of his arrest, took on new and troubling significance. Each revelation deepened the community's sense of betrayal and violated trust. How could they have been so wrong about someone? How could a person maintain such a convincing facade for so many years? How could they ever feel confident in their judgment again?
The ripple effect spread beyond Millbrook as news of Mitchell's arrest reached the other communities where his victims had lived. In Carthage, Jennifer Walsh's mother finally had an answer for 14 years of wondering. In Webb City, Rebecca Santos's family could begin the process of grieving for their daughter with the knowledge that her killer would face justice. In Neosho, Megan Torres's parents could stop imagining worst-case scenarios and start dealing with the reality of what had happened to their child. But those answers came with their own complications. The families had to grapple not only with the confirmation that their daughters were dead, something most had reluctantly accepted years earlier, but with the knowledge that they had been killed by someone who had presented himself as a protector and mentor of young people.
I trusted him, Jennifer Walsh's mother told reporters through tears. When Jennifer went missing, he was one of the volunteers who helped search for her. He brought us casseroles and offered to help however he could. He looked me in the eye and promised we'd find her, knowing the entire time that he had killed her. How does someone do that? How does someone live with that kind of deception? Sarah found herself asking the same questions as she prepared for Mitchell's interrogation. The man sitting across from her in the interview room bore little resemblance to the confident teacher she remembered from high school. 3 days in jail had aged him visibly. His skin was pale, his hair disheveled, his clothes wrinkled. But his eyes still held that same attentive quality, as if he were analyzing the situation with the same methodical approach he'd once applied to chemical equations. "I suppose you want me to explain myself?" Mitchell said, when Sarah and Agent Chen entered the room. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing a particularly challenging homework assignment rather than multiple murders. "We want you to tell us what happened to Emily Johnson," Agent Chen replied. "We want you to tell us about Jennifer Walsh, Rebecca Santos, and Megan Torres. We want you to help us understand why 4 young women who trusted you ended up dead." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the metal table between them. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had been carrying secrets for far too long. "They were extraordinary," he said softly. "Each one of them. Emily especially. She had this way of looking at the world, like she could see possibilities that other people missed. She understood that chemistry isn't just about memorizing formulas, it's about transformation, about taking something ordinary and turning it into something beautiful." Sarah felt her stomach clench at the possessive tone in Mitchell's voice, the way he spoke about Emily as if she had belonged to him. "You murdered her," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building inside her chest. "I never meant for any of them to die," Mitchell replied, and for the first time emotion crept into his voice. "You have to understand, I cared about these girls. I wanted to help them, to show them that someone appreciated their potential. But they didn't understand. They fought me, rejected what I was trying to give them." The confession that followed was more disturbing than Sarah had anticipated. Mitchell didn't deny killing the 4 girls, but he framed each murder as a tragedy rather than a crime, painting himself as a misunderstood mentor whose good intentions had been corrupted by the girls' inability to appreciate his attention. He described following Emily home from work that November evening in 2009, waiting for her at the bridge over Mill Creek, where the streetlights created shadows perfect for concealment. He'd approached her with a story about needing help moving some equipment from his car, a request that would have seemed perfectly reasonable coming from a trusted teacher. Emily had initially agreed to help, but something about the situation had triggered her instincts. Maybe it was the isolated location, maybe it was something in Mitchell's demeanor, but she'd tried to leave. The struggle that followed had lasted only minutes, but it had ended with Emily's death and the beginning of Mitchell's 14-year deception. "She was so small," Mitchell said, his voice distant as if he were describing something he'd witnessed,
rather than something he had done. I didn't realize my own strength. I just wanted her to stop screaming, to listen to what I was trying to tell her. I never intended for it to go that far. The details of how he disposed of Emily's body revealed a level of planning that contradicted his claims of impulsive action. He'd wrapped her jacket carefully in plastic sheeting, keeping it as some sort of trophy, while burying her body in a location that investigators were still trying to identify. The fact that only her jacket had been found suggested that Emily's remains might never be recovered, a reality that would add another layer of grief for her mother. Mitchell's description of the other murders followed similar patterns. Jennifer Walsh had been approached after a church camp activity, told that Mitchell had forgotten something in his car and needed help carrying it. Rebecca Santos had been lured away from a summer science program with promises of showing her advanced laboratory equipment. Megan Torres had been targeted after a regional science fair, approached in a parking lot where Mitchell claimed his car wouldn't start.
Each girl had initially trusted Mitchell because of his reputation and position. Each had realized too late that they were in danger. Each had fought back, triggering the violence that ended their lives. And each had been memorialized in Mitchell's mind not as a victim of his crimes, but as a tragic loss of potential that somehow wasn't entirely his fault. "Do you understand what you've done to their families?" Sarah asked when Mitchell paused in his narrative. "Emily's mother has been waiting 14 years for answers. These girls had futures, plans, people who loved them." Mitchell's response revealed the depth of his delusion. "Of course I understand," he said, sounding almost offended by the question. "I've grieved for each of them. I've attended memorial services, contributed to scholarship funds in their names. I've carried the weight of losing them every day since it happened." The twisted logic of his words, that he could somehow grieve for victims of his own crimes, illustrated the complete disconnect between Mitchell's perception of reality and the actual horror of his actions. In his mind, he had been a victim too, someone who had lost students he cared about, rather than someone who had murdered them. Agent Chen pressed for details about other potential victims, but Mitchell insisted that there had been only 4. "I'm not a monster," he said with apparent sincerity. "I didn't go around hunting random girls. These were special circumstances, relationships that developed over time. Emily and the others, they were unique." The interrogation continued for hours, with Mitchell providing details that would help investigators understand his methods and potentially identify physical evidence. But his inability to take full responsibility for his crimes, his persistent framing of the murders as tragic accidents rather than deliberate acts of violence, made it clear that he would never truly understand the magnitude of what he'd done. As Sarah listened to Mitchell's confession, she found herself thinking about the hundreds of students who had passed through his classroom over 30 years. How many had been potential targets who had escaped simply because circumstances hadn't aligned? How many young women had been shaped by Mitchell's teaching without ever knowing how close they might have come to becoming his victims? The weight of those questions pressed down on her as she walked back to her office after the interrogation. The parking lot was still filled with media vehicles, and reporters called out questions as she passed. How long had police suspected Mitchell? Were there other victims? How had the community missed the signs for so many years? Sarah had no answers that would satisfy them. The truth was that David Mitchell had been extraordinarily skilled at maintaining his double life, compartmentalizing his crimes while continuing to function as a respected member of the community. The signs that seemed obvious in retrospect had been subtle enough to escape notice at the time, hidden behind a reputation built over decades of apparently genuine service to young people. The first revelation that would shake Millbrook to its foundation came not from Mitchell's confession, but from an unexpected source: Catherine Mitchell's discovery of a hidden room in her own basement. 3 days after her husband's arrest, Catherine had been moving through her house like a ghost, trying to process the impossible reality that the man she'd shared a bed with for 29 years was a killer. She had been gathering items to take to her sister's house. She couldn't bear to stay in the place where she'd unknowingly lived alongside such darkness, when she noticed something odd about the basement storage area. A section of the back wall didn't quite align with the rest. When she pressed against it, a panel swung inward to reveal a small space that David had apparently carved out behind our water heater. Inside, Catherine found what investigators would later describe as a trophy room, a carefully curated collection of items belonging to his victims that Mitchell had kept as mementos of his crimes. Emily Johnson's student ID card, Jennifer Walsh's bracelet, Rebecca Santos's hair clip, Megan Torres's pen with her name engraved on the side. Each item was stored in a separate plastic bag, labeled with dates and what appeared to be Mitchell's personal notes about the circumstances of acquiring them. The handwriting was the same careful script that Catherine had seen on thousands of homework assignments and lesson plans over the years. "How did I not know?" Catherine whispered to Sarah when investigators arrived to process the scene. "How did I live in this house for 3 decades and never know there was a room behind our water heater? How did I sleep next to a man who was keeping pieces of dead girls in our basement?"
The discovery of Mitchell's trophy collection led to the second major revelation. He had been planning his crimes far more extensively than his confession had suggested. Among the items found in the hidden room were detailed files on each victim, photographs taken without their knowledge, copies of their class schedules, notes about their daily routines and family situations. The level of surveillance and planning contradicted Mitchell's claims that the murders had been impulsive acts triggered by the girl's resistance to his advances. Most disturbing was a file labeled Future Projects that contained similar surveillance materials for 12 other young women, current and former students who fit Mitchell's preferred victim profile. The file included recent photographs, schedule information, and detailed notes about their vulnerabilities and potential access points. It was clear that Mitchell had been actively planning additional crimes when his arrest interrupted his activities. Among the potential targets was Maria Santos, Rebecca Santos's younger sister, who is currently a senior at Millbrook High School. The discovery that Mitchell had been stalking Maria while her family was still grieving her sister's disappearance added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable situation. "He was going to kill my baby girl," Rebecca Santos's mother told investigators through tears. "While we were praying for Rebecca to come home, while we were holding on to hope that maybe she was still alive somewhere, he was planning to take Maria too." How do you process something like that? How do you ever feel safe again? The third revelation came from Mitchell's computer files, which contained years of correspondence with other individuals who shared his predatory interests. The FBI's cybercrimes unit discovered that Mitchell had been part of an online community where men shared strategies for identifying and accessing potential victims. The conversations revealed a network of predators who had been operating in plain sight, using their positions of trust and authority to harm the children they were supposed to protect. "We're looking at potentially dozens of additional suspects," Agent Chen told the task force assembled to investigate the broader conspiracy. "Teachers, coaches, youth ministers, camp counselors, men who used Mitchell's techniques to identify and groom potential victims. This case has opened up a web of connected crimes that could span multiple states and decades." The fourth revelation was perhaps the most shocking for longtime residents of Millbrook. Mitchell had not been operating alone in all of his crimes. Computer evidence suggested that he had an accomplice, someone who had helped him stalk and abduct at least 2 of his victims. The identity of this accomplice remained unknown, but digital forensics indicated that it was someone with intimate knowledge of the local area and access to information about potential targets. The possibility that there was another predator still free in their community sent waves of panic through Millbrook. Parents refused to let their children walk to school alone. Teachers found themselves under increased scrutiny from suspicious parents.
Every adult who had been part of the extended network around Mitchell, colleagues, neighbors, fellow volunteers, became a potential suspect in the minds of fearful residents. Sarah found herself fielding calls from terrified parents who wanted to know if their children were safe, if the schools were conducting adequate background checks, if there were other predators hiding in positions of trust throughout the community. The honest answer was that they didn't know. The investigation was ongoing, and it would take months or even years to identify all the people who might have been connected to Mitchell's crimes. The fifth revelation came from reviewing Mitchell's financial records, which showed a pattern of unexplained expenses that corresponded with his stalking and abduction activities. Cash withdrawals, purchases of supplies that could be used for restraining or transporting victims, and payments to individuals whose names appeared in his online correspondence. The financial trail suggested a level of premeditation and organization that contradicted every aspect of the caring teacher persona he had maintained for 30 decades. Perhaps most devastating was the discovery that Mitchell had used school resources to facilitate his crimes. He had accessed student records to gather personal information about potential targets, used school equipment to print photographs and surveillance materials, and exploited his position as a teacher to justify his presence at events where he could observe and photograph young women. He turned our school into his hunting ground, Superintendent Jennifer Hayes told the emergency school board meeting. He used our trust, our resources, our children's faith in the educational system to facilitate crimes that have traumatized our entire community.
Have to ask ourselves how we allowed this to happen and what we need to change to make sure it never happens again. The community's response to these revelations was swift and sometimes brutal. Parents demanded the resignation of administrators who had supervised Mitchell over the years. Teachers who had worked closely with them found themselves subject to suspicion and investigation. The school board voted to rename the science wing that had been dedicated to Mitchell's honor just 2 years earlier. But the most heartbreaking reactions came from Mitchell's former students, particularly those who had genuinely benefited from his mentorship and now found themselves questioning every positive memory they had of their time in his classroom. Support groups were established for former students struggling to reconcile their gratitude for Mitchell's influence on their education with the horror of learning about his crimes. "He changed my life," one former student told a therapist during a group session. "I was struggling with chemistry, ready to give up on my dream of becoming a doctor. Mr. Mitchell spent hours helping me understand the concepts, convinced me I was capable of succeeding. I'm a pediatrician now because of his encouragement. But how do I process the fact that the same hands that helped me learn to save children's lives also killed 4 young women? How do I separate the good he did for me from the evil he did to them?" The sixth revelation emerged from interviews with Mitchell's colleagues, several of whom admitted that they had noticed troubling behaviors over the years, but had dismissed them as eccentricities rather than warning signs. The science department secretary recalled Mitchell frequently working late hours when the building was nearly empty, often with female students. The custodial staff remembered finding his classroom door locked during times when it should have been open. Other teachers had noticed his unusual interest in photographing students at school events and his tendency to volunteer for activities that put him in close contact with teenage girls. "We told ourselves we were being paranoid," one colleague admitted to investigators. "David was so respected, so dedicated to his students. When you saw something that seemed a little off, you convinced yourself you were imagining it or that there was an innocent explanation. We were so focused on his reputation that we ignored our instincts." The seventh revelation came from reviewing security footage from various locations around Millbrook and surrounding communities. Over months of painstaking analysis, investigators were able to identify Mitchell's vehicle near the locations where each victim had disappeared. The footage provided crucial corroboration for his confessions and helped establish timelines for each crime. But the security footage also revealed something else. Mitchell had not been alone during at least 2 of the abductions. A second figure could be seen in some of the footage, someone who appeared to be helping Mitchell surveil and approach his targets. The image quality was too poor to make a positive identification, but it confirmed that Mitchell had indeed been working with an accomplice who remained at large. The 8th revelation was the discovery of additional burial sites. Using information from Mitchell's confession and analysis of his movement patterns, investigators identified 3 locations where the bodies of his victims might be found. Ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs were brought into search areas near Mill Creek, and within days they had located the remains of Jennifer Walsh and Rebecca Santos. The recovery of the bodies brought closure to families who had spent years wondering about their daughters' fates, but it also brought new questions about how Mitchell had managed to transport and bury his victims without being noticed. The burial sites were carefully concealed and showed evidence of planning that suggested Mitchell had scouted the locations well in advance of committing his crimes. Emily Johnson's remains were found buried beneath what had once been a popular hiking trail, in a location that had been searched multiple times during the initial investigation into her disappearance. The discovery highlighted how skilled Mitchell had been at hiding evidence and how thoroughly he had planned each aspect of his crimes. Megan Torres's body was found in the most disturbing location of all, buried in the backyard of an abandoned house that Mitchell had purchased under a false name 3 years before her disappearance. The property had been used as a private killing ground, a place where Mitchell could take his victims without being observed or interrupted.
The 9th revelation emerged from analysis of Mitchell's teaching evaluations and performance reviews over 30 years of employment. Several patterns became apparent when viewed in the context of his crimes. His performance reviews consistently praised his dedication to individual students, particularly those who were struggling academically or came from difficult family situations. He had specifically requested assignments that would put him in contact with vulnerable young women. Tutoring programs, after-school activities, field trips, and summer education programs. Most disturbing was the discovery that Mitchell had actively lobbied for changes in school policy that would give him greater access to students. He had argued for longer tutoring sessions, unsupervised study periods, and overnight field trips. He had volunteered for every activity that involved transporting students in private vehicles. He had positioned himself as the go-to person for helping troubled teens, knowing that these students would be less likely to report inappropriate behavior and more likely to trust an adult who seemed to understand their struggles. The final revelation was perhaps the most devastating for the community. Mitchell's crimes had been facilitated by a culture of unquestioning trust in authority figures. Multiple investigations revealed that warning signs had been reported to school administrators over the years, but these reports had been dismissed or minimized because of Mitchell's stellar reputation. Parents had complained about Mitchell's tendency to single out their daughters for special attention. Students had reported feeling uncomfortable during private tutoring sessions. Fellow teachers had noticed Mitchell's unusual interest in photographing female students. But each concern had been addressed individually, without anyone recognizing the pattern that was emerging. "We failed these girls," Superintendent Hayes admitted during a press conference. "We created a system where reputation mattered more than vigilance, where we were so committed to supporting our teachers that we ignored signs that should have triggered further investigation. We have to take responsibility for our role in allowing these crimes to continue for so long." The accumulation of revelations transformed Millbrook from a community in shock to a community in crisis. The discovery that Mitchell had been planning additional crimes, that he had an unknown accomplice, that the school system had failed to respond appropriately to warning signs. All of these factors combined to create a sense that the very foundations of their society had been corrupted.
Town hall meetings became forums for anger and recrimination. Parents demanded answers about how their children could be kept safe. Teachers struggled with the knowledge that their profession had been used as a cover for horrific crimes. Community leaders grappled with how to rebuild trust in institutions that had been revealed as inadequate to protect the most vulnerable members of society. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the families of Mitchell's victims, who found themselves dealing not just with grief and loss, but with the knowledge that their daughters' deaths could have been prevented if anyone had taken the warning signs seriously. "My Emily didn't have to die," Linda Johnson told reporters through tears. "If someone had listened when parents complained about Mr. Mitchell's behavior, if someone had investigated when students felt uncomfortable, if someone had connected the dots between his access to young women and his obsessive behavior, my daughter would still be alive today. We failed her. This whole community failed her." As Sarah stood in the police station surrounded by boxes of evidence and stacks of case files, she realized that solving Emily Johnson's murder had only been the beginning. The real work, rebuilding a community's faith in its institutions, helping survivors heal from trauma, ensuring that such crimes could never happen again, would take years or even decades to complete. The truth had finally emerged, but the cost of that truth was higher than anyone could have imagined.
6 months after David Mitchell's arrest, Millbrook began the slow, painful process of healing. The town that had once prided itself on being a safe haven for families was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, vigilance, and the price of willful blindness. But from that confrontation came changes that would reshape the community for generations to come.
The first major transformation occurred within the school system itself. Superintendent Jennifer Hayes, working with a newly elected school board, implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future tragedies. The changes went far beyond improved background checks and security cameras. They represented a fundamental shift in how the district approached student safety and adult accountability. "We're not just adding rules," Hayes explained during a community meeting held in the renovated high school auditorium. "We're changing the culture. We're moving from a system based on trust to a system based on verification and transparency. Every adult who works with our children will understand that they are being watched, that their behavior is being monitored, and that any concerns will be investigated thoroughly." The new protocols required all staff members to undergo annual psychological evaluations and participate in ongoing training about recognizing and reporting inappropriate behavior. No adult could be alone with a student without another staff member present. All tutoring sessions and after-school activities had to be conducted in open areas with clear sightlines. Video monitoring was installed in every classroom and common area, with recordings stored for a minimum of 1 year. Perhaps most importantly, the district established an anonymous reporting system that allowed students, parents, and staff to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Every report would be investigated by an external firm with no connection to the school district, ensuring that reputation and relationships could never again override safety concerns. The changes met with some resistance from teachers who felt they were being treated as potential criminals, but the community's overwhelming support for the reforms made it clear that the days of unquestioned trust in authority figures were over. Sarah found herself playing an unexpected role in the healing process. Her investigation of Mitchell's crimes had revealed not just the scope of his deception, but the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. Community leaders asked her to head a new task force charged with reviewing every aspect of how adults interacted with children in Millbrook, from schools and churches to youth sports programs and community organizations. "We can't just focus on the schools," Sarah told the task force during their first meeting.
Mitchell was able to maintain his facade because he was involved in every aspect of community life. We need to look at our churches, our volunteer organizations, our sports programs, anywhere adults have access to children without adequate oversight. The task force's work revealed troubling patterns throughout the community. Youth sports programs where coaches had almost unlimited access to young athletes. Church youth groups led by volunteers with minimal supervision. Community organizations that relied heavily on the reputation and good intentions of their adult leaders without implementing basic safety protocols. One by one, these organizations began implementing changes modeled on the school district's reforms. Background checks became standard for all adult volunteers. Training programs taught parents and children how to recognize and report inappropriate behavior. Transparency became the watchword, with open communication replacing the secrecy that had allowed predators to operate in the shadows. The healing process was particularly complex for Catherine Mitchell, who found herself in the impossible position of grieving the destruction of her marriage while supporting the families of her husband's victims. She could have fled Millbrook, started over somewhere else where her name wasn't connected to unthinkable crimes. Instead, she chose to stay and use her experience to help others understand how predators operate and how communities can better protect themselves. "I lived with him for 29 years, Catherine said during a presentation to the Parent-Teacher Association. "I shared a bed with him, ate meals with him, raised children with him. If anyone should have known what he was capable of, it should have been me. The fact that I didn't see the signs doesn't mean they weren't there. It means we need to learn to look more carefully and trust our instincts even when they contradict someone's reputation." Catherine's decision to speak publicly about her experience was both brave and healing for the community. Her honesty about the ways Mitchell had deceived her, her acknowledgement of the warning signs she had missed or dismissed, her commitment to ensuring that other families never experienced what hers had, all of these factors helped the community process their own feelings of betrayal and confusion.
She also played a crucial role in supporting the families of Mitchell's victims. Linda Johnson, in particular, found comfort in talking with the one person who had also been betrayed by David Mitchell, who understood the complexity of loving someone while learning to hate what they had done. "Catherine didn't choose to be married to a killer," Linda told Sarah during one of their monthly meetings. "She's as much a victim as anyone else. The fact that she's chosen to stay here, to help us heal, to make sure this never happens again, that means everything to me." The legal proceedings against Mitchell moved forward with an efficiency that was both satisfying and anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence and with no hope of mounting a successful defense, Mitchell's attorneys negotiated a plea agreement that would spare the community the trauma of a lengthy trial while ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The plea hearing was held on a gray March morning, exactly 16 months after Emily Johnson's jacket had been discovered in Riverside Park. Linda Johnson sat in the front row of the courthouse, flanked by Sarah and other family members. She wore a locket containing Emily's photograph, the same locket she had worn every day since her daughter's disappearance. When Mitchell was asked to enter his plea, he stood slowly and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Guilty," he said, and with that single word, officially acknowledged responsibility for crimes that had shattered multiple families and changed an entire community forever. The families of his victims were given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. Linda Johnson's statement was brief but powerful. "You took my daughter's life, but you didn't break her spirit. Emily believed in making the world a better place, and even in death she's doing that. The changes we've made because of what you did to her will protect other children. Emily's legacy will be that future daughters get to grow up safely in a community that learned from our tragedy." Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
4 consecutive life sentences to ensure that he would never again pose a threat to young women. As he was led away in shackles, he didn't look back at the families whose lives he had destroyed. Sarah wondered if he was finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done, or if he remained convinced that he was somehow more victim than perpetrator. The investigation into Mitchell's accomplice continued for months after his sentencing, but ultimately proved fruitless. Despite extensive analysis of evidence and hundreds of interviews, investigators were never able to identify the second person who appeared in security footage from 2 of the crime scenes. The failure to solve this aspect of the case remained a source of frustration for law enforcement and ongoing anxiety for the community. But it didn't diminish the sense of justice that came with Mitchell's conviction. As the 1-year anniversary of Emily's discovery approached, the community planned a memorial service that would honor all 4 of Mitchell's victims while celebrating the positive changes that had emerged from tragedy. The service was held in the newly renamed Emily Johnson Memorial Park, the site where her jacket had been found, now transformed into a place of remembrance and hope. The memorial featured 4 trees planted in honor of Emily, Jennifer, Rebecca, and Megan, surrounded by a garden that would bloom with different flowers throughout the growing season. A bronze plaque bore their names and the inscription, "In memory of bright lights extinguished too soon and in commitment to protecting the lights that still shine." The service drew hundreds of people from throughout the region, family members, friends, teachers, law enforcement officers, and community members whose lives had been touched by the tragedy. Sarah stood at the back of the crowd, watching as speaker after speaker talked about the importance of vigilance, the power of community action, and the responsibility everyone shared for protecting vulnerable members of society. But the most powerful moment came when Linda Johnson approached the podium to speak about her daughter's legacy. "Emily always said that chemistry was about transformation," she began, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She believed that you could take basic elements and combine them to create something entirely new, something better than what you started with.
"That's what we've done here," Linda continued. "We've taken the basic elements of tragedy and grief and fear, and we've combined them with love and determination and hope to create something new. We've created a community that's stronger, more vigilant, more committed to protecting our children. Emily would be proud of what we've built from the ashes of what we lost." The memorial service marked a turning point for Millbrook. While the community would never forget the horror of Mitchell's crimes or the girls whose lives were lost, they had successfully transformed their grief into action, their fear into vigilance, their betrayal into a commitment to do better. Sarah looked around at the faces in the crowd, parents holding their children a little closer, teachers reflecting on their responsibilities, community leaders planning additional reforms. The changes initiated by Emily's case had created ripple effects that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders, inspiring other communities to examine their own vulnerabilities and implement similar protections. In the months that followed, Sarah received calls from law enforcement agencies across the country asking for guidance on implementing the protocols that Millbrook had developed. The community's response to tragedy had become a model for how to transform heartbreak into hope, how to honor victims by protecting future potential victims. The investigation that had begun with a DNA match in a cold case had evolved into something much larger, a comprehensive examination of how communities could better protect their most vulnerable members. Sarah realized that her work on Emily's case had prepared her for a larger mission, helping other communities learn from Millbrook's painful experience before they had to endure their own tragedies. As the sun set over Emily Johnson Memorial Park on that anniversary evening, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had eluded her throughout the investigation. Emily's killer had been brought to justice.
Her community had been transformed for the better. Her legacy would live on in the thousands of children who would be safer because of the changes made in her memory. The work was far from over. Healing never truly ends, and vigilance requires constant effort. But for the first time since she'd opened Emily's case file 2 years earlier, Sarah felt hopeful about the future. Millbrook had faced its darkest hour and emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed to protecting the innocent. Emily Johnson's name would never be forgotten. Neither would the lessons learned from her death or the changes made in her honor. In the end, that was perhaps the most fitting memorial of all, a living legacy that would continue to save lives for generations to come. 3 years later, Sarah Martinez stood in the parking lot of the newly constructed Millbrook Community Safety Center, watching his families arrive for the annual Emily Johnson Memorial Safety Fair. Children ran between booths displaying information about personal safety, digital literacy, and recognizing inappropriate behavior from adults. Parents attended workshops on communication strategies and community vigilance. The event had grown from a small memorial gathering into a regional conference that drew participants from throughout Missouri and neighboring states. The transformation was remarkable. What had begun as a community's response to tragedy had evolved into a comprehensive model for child protection that was being studied and replicated across the country. Sarah had been invited to speak at conferences in 12 states, sharing Millbrook's story and helping other communities develop their own safety protocols before crisis forced their hand. "Detective Martinez?" A young woman approached, extending her hand with a confident smile. "I'm Rebecca Mitchell. Well, Rebecca Mitchell Williams now. I wanted to thank you for everything you did during that horrible time." Sarah recognized her immediately as David Mitchell's daughter, though she looked healthier and more at peace than she had during the nightmare of her father's arrest and trial. Rebecca had completed her graduate degree in education and was now working as a school principal in Springfield, where she'd implemented many of the safety protocols developed in Millbrook. "How are you managing?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about how the Mitchell children had processed their father's crimes and rebuilt their lives.
"It's been a long journey," Rebecca replied honestly. "Therapy helped. Changing my name helped. But mostly, it's helped to focus on preventing what happened to Emily and the others from happening to anyone else. I can't change what my father did, but I can make sure the schools I lead never become hunting grounds for predators." Rebecca's brother Michael had made similar choices, leaving education temporarily to work with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, where he helped develop profiles of educators who might pose risks to students. The Mitchell children had transformed their family's legacy of harm into a commitment to protection and healing. "Your father never told us where Megan Teresa's remains are buried," Sarah said, knowing it was a difficult topic, but one that needed addressing. "Her family still doesn't have closure." Rebecca's expression darkened. "He still writes to me sometimes. Letters I never open, but my attorney reviews them in case he ever provides information about Megan. So far, he's maintained his position that he doesn't remember the specific location. Whether that's true or just his final way of controlling the situation, I don't know." The search for Megan Teresa's body continued, though with diminishing hope as the years passed. Her family had found some measure of peace in knowing who had killed their daughter and why, but the lack of remains to bury had complicated their grieving process in ways that were painful to witness. Sarah moved through the safety fair, observing the children who were growing up in this new reality of heightened awareness and protection. 5-year-olds practiced saying no to adults who made them uncomfortable. 8-year-olds learned about appropriate versus inappropriate physical contact. Teenagers attended workshops on digital safety and recognizing predatory behavior in online spaces. She worried sometimes about creating a generation of children who were too suspicious, too afraid of the adults who genuinely wanted to help them. But the alternative, maintaining the naive trust that had allowed David Mitchell to operate undetected for decades, was unacceptable.
"Sarah!" Linda Johnson's voice called out across the crowd. Emily's mother looked remarkable for someone who had endured such profound loss. She'd thrown herself into advocacy work, becoming a nationally recognized speaker on child safety and community vigilance. The Emily Johnson Foundation, which she'd established 2 years earlier, provided funding for safety programs in small communities that couldn't afford to implement comprehensive reforms on their own. Emily's story is still saving lives. Linda's transformation had been one of the most inspiring aspects of the community's healing process. Rather than allowing grief to consume her, she channeled her pain into action that was preventing other families from experiencing similar losses. The Foundation's work had directly influenced policy changes in 14 states and had provided safety training to over 50,000 children and adults. "Have you heard from Catherine lately?" Sarah asked. David Mitchell's widow had become an unexpected friend to Linda, and their mutual support had been crucial for both women's healing processes. "She's speaking at a conference in Denver next week," Linda replied. "I still can't believe how brave she's been, using her experience to help other communities understand how predators operate. It would have been so much easier for her to disappear, but she chose to stay and help us heal." Catherine Mitchell had indeed become one of the most effective advocates for community safety reforms. Her unique perspective as someone who had unknowingly lived with a predator for decades gave her credibility with audiences who might have dismissed warnings from law enforcement or child safety experts. She spoke regularly at conferences, wrote articles for educational journals, and consulted with organizations developing safety protocols. Her decision to remain in Millbrook and use her maiden name professionally had been controversial initially, but the community had gradually appreciated her courage and commitment to preventing future tragedies. She continued teaching at the elementary school, where her experience had made her particularly skilled at helping children understand personal safety without creating unnecessary fear. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself in conversation with Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who had moved to Millbrook specifically to study the community's response to trauma and transformation. Dr. Foster's research focused on how communities could heal from betrayal by trusted authority figures while maintaining the social bonds necessary for healthy development. "What you've accomplished here is unprecedented," Dr. Foster told Sarah as they watched teenagers participate in a workshop on healthy relationships. "Most communities that experience this type of institutional betrayal either become paralyzed by fear or fragment into suspicious factions that can never rebuild trust. Millbrook has somehow managed to become more vigilant without becoming paranoid, more protective without becoming isolated. The balance had been difficult to achieve and required constant attention. The community had learned to distinguish between reasonable caution and destructive suspicion, between protective vigilance and corrosive fear. Children were taught to trust their instincts while still being open to appropriate adult guidance. Parents learned to ask questions without becoming interrogators. Teachers understood that transparency was the price of maintaining trust." Sarah spotted Maria Santos across the fair, now a college freshman studying criminal justice with plans to become a victim advocate. Maria's survival, she had been one of the potential targets identified in Mitchell's Future Projects file, had been both a relief and a source of ongoing anxiety for her family. Knowing that she had been stalked by her sister's killer while the community remained unaware of the danger had been almost as traumatic as losing Rebecca. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Emily's jacket hadn't been found," Maria told Sarah when they crossed paths near the memorial garden. "Would he have eventually killed me too? How many other girls were on his list? How long could he have continued if construction hadn't started at the park?" The questions haunted everyone who had been involved in the case. The randomness of Emily's discovery, construction delayed for years by budget constraints, finally starting just as Mitchell might have been preparing to claim another victim, highlighted how much of justice depended on chance and timing. It was sobering to realize that without that accidental discovery, Mitchell might still be teaching chemistry and hunting new victims. 5 years later, Sarah received a call that would test everything Millbrook had learned about healing and vigilance. A construction crew renovating an old building in nearby Webb City had discovered human remains buried in the basement. Initial analysis suggests that the bones belonged to a teenage girl who had been dead for approximately 8 to 10 years. The discovery immediately raised questions about whether David Mitchell might have had additional victims that investigators had never identified. Sarah drove to Webb City as part of the consulting team brought in to assist with the investigation, her mind racing through the implications of finding another potential victim. The remains were eventually identified as those of Jessica Chen, a 17-year-old who had disappeared from Webb City in 2013, 2 years after Mitchell's final known victim. Jessica had been a student at a regional science camp where Mitchell had served as a volunteer instructor. She fit his victim profile perfectly: intelligent, ambitious, from a single-parent household, interested in environmental science. But DNA evidence and other forensic analysis revealed that Mitchell had not killed Jessica Chen. Instead, the investigation uncovered another predator who had been operating in the same region during the same time period, using similar methods to identify and abduct young women. The discovery led to the arrest of Marcus Webb, a youth pastor who had been preying on teenage girls for over a decade. The Webb case forced Millbrook to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their community's experience with David Mitchell was not unique. Predators existed in every community, hidden behind facades of respectability and service. The safety protocols they had developed were not just responses to one man's crimes. They were necessary defenses against a persistent threat that required constant vigilance. "This is why we do this work," Linda Johnson told a gathering of parents and community leaders after Webb's arrest. "Not because David Mitchell was uniquely evil, but because men like him exist everywhere. The question isn't whether predators are active in our communities. The question is whether we're doing everything we can to identify them before they harm our children."
7 years after Emily's discovery, Sarah was promoted to chief of police when Robert Hawkins retired. Her first major initiative was the establishment of a regional task force that would coordinate child safety efforts across multiple jurisdictions. The task force included representatives from law enforcement, schools, churches, youth organizations, and mental health services, all working together to create a comprehensive network of protection and support. The task force's work led to the identification and prosecution of 3 additional predators operating in the region, including a Little League coach who had been sexually abusing players for 5 years, and a church youth director who had been grooming teenagers through social media. The early intervention prevented these men from escalating to more serious crimes and spared numerous children from trauma and harm. Sarah often reflected on how her role had evolved from investigating crimes after they occurred to preventing them before they happened. The reactive approach of traditional law enforcement, responding to crimes and gathering evidence for prosecution, had been supplemented by a proactive strategy focused on education, awareness, and early intervention. The transformation wasn't limited to law enforcement. Teachers had become trained observers, skilled at recognizing signs of abuse or inappropriate adult behavior. Parents had learned to ask specific questions about their children's interactions with adults and to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. Children had been taught to speak up about uncomfortable situations and to understand that they would be believed and protected when they reported concerns. 10 years later, Sarah stood once again in Emily Johnson Memorial Park, this time addressing a crowd gathered for the dedication of a new monument. The monument featured the names of all known victims of predators in the region, including Emily, Jennifer, Rebecca, Megan, Jessica Chen, and others whose cases had been solved through the collaborative efforts of the regional task force. But the monument also included a different type of memorial, the names of children whose lives had been saved through early intervention, prevention programs, and community vigilance. The list included dozens of names, children who had been removed from abusive situations before serious harm occurred, teenagers who had been protected from predators through education and awareness programs,
young people who had found the courage to report inappropriate behavior because they knew they would be believed and supported. Emily's legacy isn't just about catching killers, Sarah told the crowd during the dedication ceremony. It's about creating a community where children are protected, where adults are accountable, where everyone understands their role in keeping our most vulnerable members safe. We've learned that preventing tragedy is better than solving crimes, that education is more powerful than investigation, that communities working together can accomplish what law enforcement alone never could. Linda Johnson, now in her 70s but still actively involved in advocacy work, approached the microphone to speak about her daughter's continuing impact. Emily wanted to make the world a cleaner, safer place, she said, her voice strong despite the years of grief she had carried. She didn't get the chance to do that as an environmental scientist, but she's done it anyway. Every child who grows up safer because of the changes we made in her memory is part of Emily's legacy. Every predator who chooses not to act because they know they're being watched is a victory for Emily's spirit. 15 years after Emily's discovery, the Millbrook model had been implemented in over 200 communities across 23 states. The Emily Johnson Foundation had provided funding and training to establish safety programs that had directly protected thousands of children and led to the identification and prosecution of dozens of predators. Sarah, now approaching retirement, had written a book about the case and the community's response that had become required reading in criminal justice programs and child safety training courses. She regularly spoke at conferences and consulted with communities developing their own safety protocols. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of success was the generation of young people who had grown up in Millbrook after the reforms were implemented. These teenagers and young adults had been raised with an understanding of personal safety and community responsibility that was fundamentally different from previous generations. They knew how to recognize inappropriate behavior from adults. They understood the importance of reporting concerns and supporting friends who disclosed abuse. They had been taught that their safety was everyone's responsibility, and that speaking up about uncomfortable situations was not only acceptable, but essential.
Most importantly, they had learned that trust was not the same as naivety, that vigilance was not the same as paranoia, and that protecting children was not just the responsibility of parents and law enforcement, but of every member of a healthy community. 20 years later, Sarah received a letter that brought the story full circle. The letter was from Emily Johnson, not the Emily who had been killed in 2009, but her namesake, born to a young couple who had moved to Millbrook specifically because of its reputation as a safe place to raise children. Dear Chief Martinez, the letter began, written in the careful handwriting of a 10-year-old. My mom told me I was named after a girl who died before I was born, but who helped make Millbrook a safe place for kids like me. I wanted to say thank you for catching the bad man who hurt her and for making the rules that keep us safe now. I'm in 5th grade and I want to be a police officer like you when I grow up so I can help protect kids too. The letter was accompanied by a drawing of Emily Johnson Memorial Park, complete with the 4 memorial trees and the bronze plaque honoring the victims. At the bottom of the drawing, young Emily had written, "A place where we remember and a place where we're safe." Sarah hung the letter and drawing in her office, where they served as daily reminders of why the work mattered and how the legacy of tragedy could be transformed into hope for future generations. Emily Johnson's name lived on not just in memorials and monuments, but in the safety and security of thousands of children who would never know how close they might have come to danger in a world without the protections her death had inspired. The investigation that had begun with a DNA match in a cold case had evolved into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. A comprehensive transformation of how communities protect their children,
how institutions maintain accountability, and how ordinary people can work together to prevent extraordinary evil. As Sarah prepared for retirement, she knew that the work would continue without her. The systems and protocols that had emerged from Emily's case had become institutionalized, embedded in the culture and practices of not just Millbrook, but hundreds of other communities that had learned from their experience. The final chapter of Emily Johnson's story was still being written, one protected child at a time, one prevented crime at a time, one community at a time. And in that ongoing story, the bright 16-year-old who had dreamed of making the world a better place had achieved her goal in ways she never could have imagined. The last entry in Sarah's case notes, written on the day of her retirement, captured the essence of what had been accomplished. Emily Johnson's murder was solved on October 15, 2023, when David Mitchell was arrested. But Emily Johnson's case will never be closed because her legacy continues to save lives every day. In the end, that may be the most fitting resolution of all, not just justice for the dead, but protection for the living. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.